We're following breaking news on the tensions between Canada and the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump has abruptly reversed course on a new trade relationship between Canada and China. Trump had previously supported the recently signed deal, but now he's making fresh tariff threats over that very agreement. Linda is back with more.
What if Canada stops potash exports to the United States? This will trigger an unprecedented agricultural crisis that threatens to devastate American farming operations across the country. The decision might come as trade tensions between Ottawa and Washington are almost reaching a breaking point, with Prime Minister Mark Carney wielding Canada's control over 85 to 87% of U.S. potash imports as a strategic weapon against President of the United States Donald Trump's tariff regime. The United States imports 93% of the potash. It uses with import needs exceeding production capacity by more than tenfold. Canada supplies roughly 85% of potash imports to the US, with other primary import sources including Russia at 11%, Belarus at 4%, and Israel at 3%. The US produced roughly 400,000 metric tons of potash in 2023, while domestic potash consumption that year was approximately 5.3 million metric tons. Josh Linville, Vice President of Fertilizer at StoneX, stated that Canada supplies nearly 90% of the potash imported into the US, and there are few viable alternatives. The problem is, if we start to upset Canada, where else around on the world do you start to go? Linville stated, unlike some other tariffs, where the seller bears the brunt of the cost, potash exports are different because Canada holds the cards in this supply relationship, and domestic US production cannot fill the gap. Potash is an irreplaceable component of modern agricultural production, according to the Fertilizer Institute. The U.S. has historically sourced nearly all the potash used by farmers from international markets. Potash deposits are geographically specific, and mine development in the U.S. is time-intensive and costly. No substitutes exist for potash as an essential plant nutrient. Canada has the world's largest potash reserves, with 1.1 billion tons of potash, which is 5 times larger than US reserves. Canada's scale of potash mining by production volumes was 36 times larger than the US. In 2024, Canada contributes approximately 32% to global production with its vast Saskatchewan reserves, making it a key player in the potash industry. Fertilizers account for roughly 30 to 45% of a US farmer's annual operating cost, depending on the crop. According to U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service, data since 2020 fertilizer accounts for 33 to 44% of costs for corn production. As farmers are vulnerable to volatility in input prices, they often cannot pass rising input costs onto consumers since many sell into commodity markets such as corn, wheat, and soybeans. The Economic Research Service reports that relative to historical averages between 2010 and 2019 in 2022, fertilizer costs per acre were 110% higher for corn and 141% higher for wheat. Though fertilizer prices have dropped since the end of 2022, when they were driven by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the cost to buy fertilizer, as compared to the price for a bushel of corn, shows the delicate balance required as farmers evaluate application levels. The U.S. prices paid index tracking costs paid by U.S. farmers rose to 149.9 inches June 2025, up from 139.9 the year before. Over the same period, fertilizer costs were the primary driver for rising costs, for U.S. crop farmers up 11% in the index. Farmer affordability remains under pressure considerably from levels in early 2020. Although corn prices have slid, the price of fertilizers has not. This means more bushels of corn must be produced to buy 1 ton of fertilizer as producers aim to offset lower profitability. Without Canadian potash, U.S. farmers face catastrophic consequences. The large 2025 harvest depleted phosphate and potash from the soil, which must be restored to maintain next year's productivity and yield. Growers need to replenish potash and phosphate levels in soil to avoid lower crop yields next year. Lack of global fertilizer supply is constraining demand in the near term. In the US, there are 5 states with significant enough potash rock: New Mexico, Utah, North Dakota, Arizona, and Michigan. However, these facilities cannot rapidly scale up production. For years, facilities in Carlsbad, New Mexico were fighting with lower quality potash rock. The timeline to develop new potash mines is measured in years, not months, making immediate replacement of Canadian supply impossible. President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced a $12 billion aid package for farmers who have faced steep losses this year because of his administration's trade policy. However, these funds are unlikely to cover the total costs. They also will not address the problem of farm input costs, the largest of which is fertilizer outstripping farm revenue. U.S. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins described fertilizer input cost inflation as skyrocketing. Net U.S. farm income already forecast to fall. $30 billion would deteriorate further without Canadian potash. Application rates may fall, reducing U.S. demand and creating a worsening liquidity crunch that would depress crop yields. Farming industry groups like the American Farm Bureau Federation say farmers have suffered losses on most major crops for 3 straight years amid high global inflation and supply chain constraints. The implications of leveraging potash in a trade war are profound. The United States, which sources over 80% of its potash from Canada, faces significant agricultural setbacks with access restricted. Before any escalation, figures such as Chuck Grassley, a Republican senator from Iowa, had already advocated for exemptions of potash from President of the United States Donald Trump's tariffs, emphasizing its indispensability. The debate extends to industry stakeholders who emphasize the necessity of maintaining robust fertilizer supply chains to ensure productive harvests and mitigate financial strain on American farmers. Corey Rosenbusch, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Fertilizer Institute, stated that an open, fair, predictable, and transparent trade environment between the U.S. and Canada is vital to supporting a strong, competitive fertilizer industry that meets the needs of American growers. Restrictions on this critical cross-border trade drive up costs for farmers, which could ultimately be felt at the grocery store by consumers. Additionally, Canada supplies U.S. growers with nearly 10% of their nitrogen fertilizer needs, accounting for 25% of total nitrogen fertilizer imports, and nearly 20% of sulfur consumed by U.S. farmers. Any disruption to the intertwined and mutually beneficial cross-border fertilizer trade between the U.S. and Canada has significant ripple effects, not just for farmers, but for the broader food supply chain, and ultimately the prices consumers pay at the grocery store. In November 2025, the U.S. added potash to the critical minerals list, defining it as strategically essential. Yet Canada, America's primary source of this critical mineral, is simultaneously the target of tariff threats. $12 billion aid package may represent a preemptive buffer for farmers ahead of tariff pain, but it cannot resolve the fundamental supply shortage created by losing access to Canadian potash. Carol McCausland, a professor of land and food systems at the University of British Columbia, stated that an export ban would be kind of like going to the nuclear option. She added, consumers may not see the impact of higher prices related to potash for some time, as the import cost increases work their way into the food supply chain. That will make it important for both Canadian and American stakeholders to make clear why consumers are paying more. Without Canadian potash, U.S. farmers must turn to alternative sources that are more expensive, harder to access, and insufficient in volume.